the data actually telling us? As designers, how do we really actually start to use the data that we are collecting to really design the right people experiences, or for that matter, the customer experiences as well, right? Because a lot of our initiatives impact the customer as well. So how do we, really turn that around and design an effective experience in this challenging period of time? The other thing is really about us as being facilitators. How do we use data to actually turn that into meaningful insight and use that to work with multiple departments and business units around the organization? So be it, the business, the operations, the PMO, the rest of the project team, HR, all those, how do we work with them to really, bring to life what's the right thing for our organization, for our people during this period of time? And last but not least, as a planner, how do we, really move the different pieces in the chessboard in a way that actually makes sense for the organization, that actually helps us through this, crisis period of time? And really, when you look at all of that, it's really us being leaders, right? Us being leaders to really help the rest of the organization. So one of the key things is really, how do we start this by understanding the impact on your organization? This is really an important first step. And it's really taking that lens of the analyst, right? To really flesh out, to map out, and really foresee what are the dots on the page and how do we join those dots of what's actually emerging. And so there's a few different techniques we can use, right? So for us in change management, this is something that is really part of our core skill set, right? So we're great at doing our work on change impact assessment, change impact analysis. But I think maybe taking this one step further, how do we really structure this in a way that's very visual and mapping things out for example, in this case, it's a logic tree. And so let's take one example. So let's take an example of an insurance company. During this period of time, as an insurance company, we know that a lot of offshore centers are closing or closed. So in the Philippines, it's in full lockdown. There's impacts in South Africa. There's impacts in India as well. So when your offshore centers are closed, what you need to do, looking at this logic tree diagram in the middle, is you'll have to quickly ramp up or scale up your onshore call centers to really make up for that gap or the difference. And it's pretty much all hands on deck. So what that means is a lot of your non-customer facing colleague who have experience as dealing with customers, they could be pulled out of their normal roles to actually support the business on really managing the call volume. And it could be that your subject matter experts that you work with on your projects could also be pulled as well. And so what that means is very limited business capacity for change initiatives right now. It could be that your onshore system has bandwidth pressures because everyone's working from home. Your operational routines are disrupted because there's lots of operational, you're again that BCP mode. So BAU is no longer the case. So your routines could be cancelled or affected. So is it that a lot of your steering committee meetings or your other meetings with the business are disrupted as a result? Looking at the business performance side of the picture. So on the left-hand side, we see that, it could be that, okay, so because a lot of, your smaller, medium enterprise businesses are impacted because their businesses are suffering. So is it that there's a drop in commercial policy renewal? So you're not really going to get the renewal or the sales that you're after. So what that means is decreased revenue, increased, pressure on margins, and is it that your marketing expenditures isn't really going to give you the return on investment that you're looking for? And so what does that mean to the colleagues that you're working with in that part of the business? And how might you work with them differently? And then on the right-hand side, you've got, so this is the part that we all know, right? So social distancing for employees, we're working from home. How do we work in that environment when, the organization is still trying to deliver to its productivity and its performance given this environment? And, do our leaders and our managers have the right capability uplift in that virtual management environment? For those working from home with children, again, a challenge. And, the tech equipment, bandwidth challenges. So I guess you probably get my example. So what this is really talking to is, how do you really map all of this out and be able to really understand what's emerging within the organization and actually use this to then come up with recommendations and planning or replanning as a result. So this is one example, but you could do the same with any organization, right? With government, with, medical, industry, the activity is the same. Okay, so let's jump into the next section. Actually, Oren, maybe just stop a little bit to see if there are any questions at this stage.
Not that I can see at this moment. But
okay, no worries. So guys, again, feel free to drop any questions as we go. If you want me to slow down or focus on certain things, feel free to type away. Okay, so in the next section, what we're going to be talking about is really how we actually go down to the next level. So we've talked about, okay, so now that we understand what's going on, what's emerging across the organization, at the next level, what are some of those impacts that we're looking at specifically? So one, the people impacts. Two, the impacts on the business performance of the organization. Three, how does that then impact your prioritization focus? And four, what that means to the governance of the initiatives and what's going to be different. So these are some of the four key impact areas that we're going to be diving into. So we'll talk through each of these one by one. Okay, so the first one in terms of people capacity. So this is, for us working in change, this is probably the first thing we think about, right? So what's the capacity of our people, our colleagues out there in the business? And a lot of us are thinking, the first thing would be, okay, the frontline colleagues, the customer serving colleagues, and what they'll be going through in this period of time, given this, in most industries, increased volumes, right? So supermarkets are going crazy because people are queuing to get the food. If you work in financial services, the volumes are through the roof. And again, because there's restricted travel, one of the few ways to reach businesses is through the telephone, right? So what are some of those impacts on the people? And therefore, what are the impacts on the first line managers out there in the business? How do they need to work differently? What about the subject matter experts or other stakeholders? How are their roles impacted in this environment? So just a little bit about how we might actually measure and assess people impact. So at the Change Compass, there's a few things we do. We calculate our impact based on the number of initiatives, the impact levels. So when we do our change impact assessments per impact, that could be one source of measurement in terms of the level of impact on people. So in this chart, you can see that that could be actually linked to time. So a lot of your impacts could be equated to a period of time. So it could be that we're actually sending people on training and that's going to be 3 hours, or that to undergo and learn how to get used to this new process, it's going to take them probably, a day or so to really practice and exercise and get familiar with that new process. So that's about time. Because it could be that, when you're releasing a new system, the impact could be a few days, whereas, if someone's actually going through a much more transformational change, it could take weeks to really get used to that new way of working, right? The other thing is how many people are actually impacted and how many people are we talking about. It could be that the impact is for a small team of 10 or 20 versus the whole department of 500 people are impacted. So again, that would look very different in terms of the scale of the impact on the business. And so when we start to look at the measurements of people capacity and the impact on them, you could actually do very high impact things like you could start to actually plot your change saturation points. So, this is going to take a period of time, right? So it's not that you could generate the data and be able to come up with your change saturation immediately. It's going to take a number of months to figure out what the business is going through, how they're adjusting to that particular level of impact, and when might be that change saturation point beyond which it's too much for them to handle. And this would be different by different business units. So you could have a business unit where they had very strong leaders, it's a very mature business, they're very productive, very effective, and they're able to tolerate a much higher change saturation point than other business units. And so you will definitely see differences between different parts of the business. And so collecting that data, working with the business to get that feedback over time is going to help you to create that line of the change saturation. You could even do things like plotting the resourcing level against your impact to see if we're actually talking about the call center, is there a period of time that the resourcing level goes down, but we're actually implementing a range of initiatives? So is that going to be a key risk that we cannot afford to have? And so do we need to then push out some of those initiatives during that period of time? So again, this is about really finding your baseline around what are the impacts, how do you use data to articulate the levels of impact across different initiatives for different parts of the business. Okay, so we have a question. In our organization, we moved everybody to work from home in a matter of a couple of weeks, having never really worked from home in the past. Do you have a sense how long it might take employees adjust to this type of change? So Blair, we'll actually talk about this later on in terms of how we actually tweak our change approach, given everyone's working from home. But I guess, everyone will have different points of view on this, but from my experience, Blair, it really depends on the part of the business. From my experience, there's one part of the business that I've worked with in the past where it's taken them a number of months, or in another part of the business, actually a whole year to really get used to how to really perfect this new way of working. It's almost that sort of hierarchy of needs, isn't it? Firstly, are you able to connect to the technology effectively? Do you know how to use the system? Do you know how to, share effectively, host chats? And then do you understand a lot of the virtual working tips around using body language, using tone of voice? checking and slowing down and pausing and actually going around the whole room to ensure that everyone is connected and is engaged. So there's a lot of tips and tricks around working virtually that if they haven't experienced that, it's a skill for them to learn that. It doesn't come overnight, and it takes, you know, a period of time to get there. And I would say in a few weeks, it's very hard for someone to learn that within a few week period. And then as you go up the I guess that pyramid or that ladder, it's really how do you engage virtually? How do you lead virtually? And so what are some of the skills? And so there's a lot of resources out there on the net in that regard. We'll touch on a little bit towards the end, but feel free to ask other questions if you really want to drill down on that a bit more. But thanks for that, Blair. Good question. Okay, so when we dive, so we talked about people capacity. So just as an example, these are some of the charts that we generate in Change Compass. And so again, a lot of the people focus on employee heat map, but you'll notice the difference between this chart and the previous chart. So this is very categorical because heat maps are very categorical, one color or the next color, whereas the previous chart is probably a lot more detailed because, you know, in this BCP environment, when there's a lot going on, your operations will be looking at number of hours, you know, how much time are we talking about and what can we afford to do versus not do? So that's really the detail that they're really looking for. So it may be that your heat map isn't gonna really cut it at this stage because it's too high level. And let's also not forget the customer. So how are we understanding the customer impacts? What are the customers going through? We know, like in financial services, for example, there's a lot of focus on vulnerable customers because in this period of time, you know, a lot of people are out there with families. There might be financial hardships. They've lost their job. There could be suffering from domestic violence that's intensified because everyone's at home. So there's also situations that are very vulnerable for people to be in right now. So how do we become mindful of that? Okay, so just a question from John. In a case where we quickly need to harvest this type of information, do you have any thoughts how we could pull this together organizationally? And we may not be quite there yet. So John, that's a really good question. It does take a bit of time to, you know, collect information, to analyze it, and to, you know, use this in you know, timely, which is now because your stakeholders are telling you, I need this information now. How can you help me now to get there? I guess there is no easy answer to that because if you want data-focused recommendations, it does take time. What you could do is start with, and later on we'll talk about scenarios, right? You could actually make assumptions and just generate different scenarios without a lot of the legwork at this stage that you could probably supplement afterwards when you've had more time to do the legwork, but maybe just using scenarios, using assumptions to actually talk to your stakeholders about how do we give you recommendations of likely scenarios and how we could reprioritize the portfolio or the set of initiatives. So great questions, John. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk a bit about is the second type of impact is business performance impact. So this is really about those performance metrics that your company uses. So it could be your customer satisfaction, service availability, downtime, call waiting period, you know, all that good stuff that your company measures. What does that look like? What is emerging even before you get the full set of data from your operations? But what are we starting to see? So again, this is linking back to the work that you've done earlier to really map out, using that logic tree, what's happening around the organization, and is it starting to come true? Are we starting to see that in the business performance? And so that's a really good way for you to have yardstick around what's happening with across the company, and therefore, what do you need to do differently? Do you need to adjust a lot of your measurements from a change perspective? Do you need to be more sensitive in terms of certain teams? And what are some of the key performance areas that they're focusing on? Is it customer volume? Is it service availability? Is it system performance? What are some of those items that they're focused on? So a comment from Ray, we had a very similar situation. Overall, we're finding people are adjusting more quickly than we anticipated. So great call out, Ray. We're ensuring that managers have dedicated time with each of the team members, and they're using video both for the one-on-ones as well as team meetings. Absolutely, and great point, Ray. Thanks for pointing that out. And people are very adaptive, right? Like we're thrown in this like in the last minute, and it's a little bit sink or swim, isn't it? But basically, people are adaptive, and we do, learn how to deal with that environment. So people will figure out what works for them over time. Okay, so comment from David, assume that organizations need a COVID response plan in order to assess the impacts on people, governance, etc. E.g., plan says shift XYZ services to digital suspense services. So yes, absolutely right, David. Depending on the organization, maybe it's your PMO, your strategy team, or whoever it is that's actually, come up with a plan that's saying, let's do A or B. But as a change practitioner, our role is really actually to support them in doing that, because we're the experts when it comes to, the people impacts and the impacts on the organization. So how do we actually support them with our lens of what's about to happen and support them in the prioritization process? And I think that's probably, one of the key roles that we play, but very good call out. Okay, so the very timely point. So the third thing is really around prioritization. And so how, given COVID-19, given a lot of the changing of initiatives of the slate, what I found really useful, and I think a lot of your PMO, EPMO guys would know this already, and this is what they do as part of their role. How do we look at what's critical now versus what's critical in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years time? And a really good framework that I refer to is the 3 horizons from Jeffrey Moore from 2011. And a lot of companies actually use this already. So a lot of the initiatives are actually prioritized or planned according to three broad different horizons. So you've got your first horizon 1, which is the current year. So for the next year, what are the things we're focused on? So it's really about shorter term impact on the business bottom line, on your revenue, on your cash flow, etc. And so if we're in this COVID-19 situation and your business that is seriously impacted, you've got to pull everything together to focus on your horizon 1, and you're not going to focus on 2 or 3. But if you're moderately impacted, you still need to actually really have a balance around how do we go through this period, this next X number of months successfully, still keep the business together, but not actually lose track of the investments we've already made for horizons 2 or 3. So horizon 2 is really that 1 to 3 year period, whereas 3 is that 3 to 6 year period is a much longer term thinking. And definitely for a lot of the large companies, this is how strategy works around investing in various initiatives. And so the horizon 2 is that, medium-term revenue growth and generating cash flow in that medium term to ensure that business still survives. And the longer term is much more forward thinking. Are we trying different technologies, different business models, and some of those things to drive those transformations? And so the role for the change practitioner here is to understand that. And so when you're actually coming up with what you feel are the different ways in which to shift things around based on people capacity or business capacity, think through the business focus on horizons 1, 2, and 3. And depending on the severity of COVID-19 impact on your business, is it just sink or swim, surviving through this? Like, if we're not going to get through these 6 months, we won't have a business. In that case, what are some of those levers that would help your business in horizon 1? Are there top initiatives that's going to be a lot more critical? Or is it that you're not going to be rolling out any initiative because it's basically all hands on deck serving the customer at the moment? And so think through how the initiatives would sustain the business, support the customers, or support the employees. Okay, so the third part of looking at the impacts is really on how is the governance and decision-making going to be impacted or be different? So I mentioned before that in this period of time, a lot of your stakeholders are pulled into all sorts of, business continuity activities and working groups. And so often the challenge is going to be your steering committee may be not available or partially available. So how do you just draw the dots around how do we need to then rethink our governance in terms of decision-making? Do we need to work through the sponsor versus the steering committee if the steering committee is not available? Are there certain things you can work through the business continuity working group? If your initiative is actually driving at something that is also a focus for that working group, how do you actually draw that linkage and get them to support you on that initiative? Has the PMO's role changed, and what are some of the things that they're focused on? Or your leadership team meetings, what are some of the things they're focused on, and how is your initiative going to help them in their decision-making right now? So just think through again, this is going to be different for different companies. So think through the impacts on decision-making and governance and what you might need to tweak differently to get what you need to move the initiative further along, or to make a decision around, we're not going to do this initiative, we're going to delay by 6 months to get that certainty. Okay, so let's now move into the space of talking about scenarios. So in the last section, we talked about, okay, now that we understand what's emerging, we've mapped out what's happening across the organization, then we dive into the different impacts, right? So we dived into, the impacts around people impacts, business performance impacts, prioritization impacts, and governance impacts. And so we've got all of that. And now what we need to do is we need to use that information to really generate meaningful and logic and or data-based scenarios. So ideally, if you've got the data, fantastic. If you don't, use a set of logics to derive what you're proposing. And it's good practice when you're working, especially with the senior leaders, to come up with at least 2 scenarios, maybe even 3, but 2 to 3 scenarios based on, so again, the work you've done on people capacity, on your, sorry, not customer, but business performance, And the third thing around, the work on prioritization considerations, it could be that your PMO has given you, this is our prioritization, and you use that in terms of mapping that against your capacity information. Or if you don't have that, think through the three different horizons and what that means to how to juggle and how to replan or plan the initiatives. And so just to show you some of the things we're about to release in the Change Compass. So what we really recommend is you do this visually. So when you're working with the stakeholders, a lot of this may just seem like alien language to them. So it's very hard to connect to what you're talking about unless you do it visually. So use your visual management, use your visual communication to make your point easier to understand and digest. And so this is one way that we do it in the Change Compass, whereby you could see that you could actually like drag certain initiatives just to picture what that scenario looks like, and basically go through your sorry, just clicked too fast. So basically just work through your list of initiatives and be able to actually drag and replan and actually make sense. What could that picture look like? So as an example, like, so in Australia, the financial year ends at the end of June. So if we actually think that, we anticipate that the COVID-19 impacts will happen until the end of June. So let's move everything then, but then you've got your end of year financial work volumes, which is fairly high for a lot of parts of the business. So then that, until mid-July, that's out already. So you don't want to be doing anything early July. And, are there other, holiday periods coming up whereby no one's going to be there, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you just really start to use visual ways of shifting things around to figure out, looking at this Tetris, what could possibly work as, 2 or 3 different scenarios for your business? And rather than trying to do this across the whole company, I would suggest break that down and start by each business unit. So focus on one business unit that has the challenge, work on that and move to the next, because they all have different challenges. What could work for one is not going to work for the next necessarily, right? So do this, break it down, start to shift things, play things around. It's a bit of a Tetris exercise, I know, but list your logics, list your constraints, and use the work you've done in the previous 3 steps. And then what you do is you highlight and call out what are the risks of options. What are some of those risks and what are some of the advantages? Question from Blair, is that capability currently available on Change Compass? Blair, good question. We're actually about to release it tomorrow, so it should be available. We realized that this is a much needed feature, so we worked on releasing that fairly quickly during this period of time, because we're all shifting things left, right, and center. So how do we do this visually is the challenge. Thanks, Claire. Okay, so another way to visually demonstrate and show what you're proposing. So you could try and overlay your scenarios as well. So it could be that your capacity, current capacity, which is shown in blue, versus your proposed shifting of scenario and what that means to the capacity of the people in that part of the business to just visually show how that's going to be different. That could be another way to do it as well. Okay, so let's get to the last section. And I think this addressed the previous question around how do we support people working virtually and working from home, etc. So I know there's a ton of stuff out there when it comes to, tips and things such as working from home, what are things to take note. So all of that's out there. And there's a lot of information around individual approaches. So how can individuals be more effective working from home? What I'm going to focus on in this section is more on, at a group level, at a organizational level, what are some of the things we could do at that broad level to really support and drive and shape the resilience? So let's talk about resilience. I really love this definition of resilience from a psychologist, Richardson, who published an article in 2002 in the Journal of Clinical Psychology. So what Richardson said was, resilience is the process of reintegrating from disruptions in life. I love that because what it's calling out is it's a process. So resilience is a process, not a one-off event. So when we think about that, it's a series of steps as opposed to one thing that someone does and adjusting to a major occurrence in such as what we're facing right now, right? And so what are some of the things that Richardson calls out, sorry, not Richardson. So a really good framework that I like to recommend here is by Patrice Bazanel in the Journal of Communication 2010. So what Patrice called out are some of these things. So crafting normalcy, affirming identity anchors, maintaining and using communication networks, and legitimizing negative feelings whilst foregrounding positive emotions such as hopefulness and self-efficacy. So I think it's actually really powerful when we think through the work that Patrice has done. So let's go through this one by one. So the first one, crafting normalcy. So what this is really about is how do we, in this period of time, how do we actually emphasize the regularities in life and making things normal and making them seem like this is actually, part of our new BAU. So, through the communications we're sending, through the routines we're having, through the framing that we're actually providing, that this is the new normal. I know like a lot of us are in, our usual daily stand-up meetings virtually. So we're not physically standing up, we're not throwing the ball to each other in agile teams, but we could do it virtually. And I've even seen teams that actually, call out the fact that I'll pass the ball to you, just virtually, showing that I'm throwing the ball at you. So it's your turn to talk about what you're doing today and tomorrow. And what are some of those rituals that we're creating? A lot of you are also in those virtual drinks, right? So Friday afternoon virtual drinks or midweek virtual drinks as part of your way of normalizing the situation. Because we used to have those drinks physically, but how about we still do that and not lose our routine? So that's about crafting the normalcy. The second point is around affirming identity anchors. So this is really, really interesting. So it's really connecting to who we are and what's our role during the crisis. So I know like for a lot of the refugees, for example, we get lots of refugees in Australia, and when they're sort of leaving their war-torn country or country suffering from crisis, often the siblings become, the parent, and that's even more enhanced if they actually lose the parents. So the siblings actually really have to step up and actually become the dad or the mom to really, lead the family through, that whole process of becoming a refugee and then landing in Australia, for example. And so what that really calls out is for us in our role, what is our role in this time of crisis? I mean, for me, it's about how do we step up and actually support the business from a planning perspective, from a facilitation perspective, from, really thinking through and forward planning what's going to happen using our superpower around understanding change impacts and really shaping that. But I guess the challenge for all of you is what do you think your role is? And what about your leaders? What's their role and what's their anchor in their identity? And how do they connect to that during this period of time? Just a really quick example. So, in Australia, as you all know, we've had that horrible bushfires recently, actually not that long ago. So we've had drought, bushfires, floods, and now coronavirus. So we've had a series of quite intense events. And so during the bushfires, there's a lot of communities that have come together to raise funds. We've had, US and Canadian firefighters flying in to support as well. So again, it's that, what's our identity? What's our role in this? How do we support each other? And how do we really come true in terms of what we stand for? Okay, third part, maintaining and using communication networks. So this part is probably very self-explanatory. I won't talk too much about it, but how do we rely on the right and effective ways of communication to make sure that things still work and we're able to function as an organization? And the last thing is around legitimizing negative emotions. So how do we acknowledge what's happening at the moment and actually, whether it's through our communication, through how we work with our leaders, our routines, how do we acknowledge what's happening and call out the fact that, yes, some people are struggling with it. Yes, leaders are not familiar with this environment, and just not ignore it, but actually acknowledge it. But how do we then turn that and really draw out some of the positive aspects as well? So yes, people are feeling a bit hopeless, they're stressed or they feel disconnected. But what's the light at the end of the tunnel? What are some of the positive things? People are finding that connecting virtually actually does work. We're surprised that technology actually enables us to communicate. So how do we draw some of the positive emotions as well as acknowledging the negative ones? So I guess what I'm taking out from Patrice's work is really, how do we use some of those suggestions in how we build, design, craft, and facilitate the way we frame things, how we communicate, the rituals we're designing as part of the change approach. And I think, and how we work with our leaders as well, because all of this would matter, especially now in adjusting to the new norm in COVID-19. So I've been talking for a very long time, and thanks for some of the questions. I wanted to also stop and see if there are any other further questions or comments. What do people think? Do you have other questions you have, other things you want to share with others? Would love to, get your comments in the next 5 minutes or so. Okay, so probably I'm not seeing any comments at the moment, which is fine. Feel free to drop me a note if you have questions after the session. We have recorded the sessions for those who have missed it. We could share this later on. And yeah, so thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Hope you have a great day. Keep well, keep healthy, keep safe. And I really hope you go out there and lead your business through all of this, because we have a really strong role to play in this. And I feel very passionate about this. So thanks, everyone, and have a great day.